Palestine. But it's a pleasure to welcome you back here to this afternoon session. There are refreshments behind you. You don't have to leave the room or use that as an excuse to leave the room. So the sodas and the drinks and the ice is right there, except for the coffee, which is outside. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our session this afternoon about Israel and Palestine. There are two of them, so the other one will be chaired by Ms. Brittany Khatib, who's also from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and one of my assistants for the Journal of the Digest of Middle East Studies. By the way, please stand up, Brittany. If you have any questions on the journal, or if you want to give her your paper, which will be appreciated, we wouldn't mind carrying it with us, or you can email it to aman@uwm.edu. We'll be very happy. Our first speaker, we have, as you know, three distinguished speakers. We start with the first one in the order of departure. Dr. Chen had to leave to catch a plane, so we thought that we will allow him to give his presentation. And contrary to my usual arrangements, I will also give you the chance to ask your questions before he departs, and then we will continue with the other two distinguished speakers. Dr. Chen is the director of the Institute of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the Jin University, and he has been one of the leading biblical scholars in China and recently pioneered in the field of Middle Eastern Studies at Shanghai University. He's also the editor-in-chief of the journal, Western Communications in the United States, and many other good things that he has accomplished. I don't want to infringe on his time by giving him the opportunity. Dr. Chen remarks will address the basis of China's pro-Palestinian stance and the current status of its implementation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Chen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to give a talk on this topic. And if you took a look at the website of the conference, it's a different topic. But the title is different. The content will be the same anyway. This is a more explicit statement, and my honored chair allow me to get questions before I leave. That would be wonderful. If it's not enough time, I left my email here, so you have questions you want to email me, feel free to do so. So I'm starting with this topic. I'll start with the conclusion. Stop again.
Am I going again? Weird.
Oh, yeah. Is it working? Oh, good.
Yeah.
It worked now. Decided to go to sleep. A little bit of my personal background, so you have you know where I am when I make some statements. Okay. I was trained in modern Hebrew back in the very early 1990s, modern Hebrew, and then went to upstate New York University to do my graduate school, and was trained in Jewish studies and Hebrew Bible. I worked in the Silicon Valley as a computer scientist, a programmer for a few years, and then went back to China, had some business, also teach the Hebrew Bible in Peking University. So last few years, there's an opportunity or there's an urge from the Chinese government to switch, reallocate its human resources, academic resources to a modern nationality or national or world region studies because of the obvious reason for China's footsteps is stepping onto other people's land and trying to get resources and natural resources, human resources to those places. And I switched at the urge of one of my colleagues to the Middle East, modern Middle Eastern study. I'm not trained in political science. So some of the statement are not very scientific, with not a lot of statistic support. But I do happen to work in the engineering field and the business field for many years, so I do treat empirical evidence very seriously. So I try to move on that direction. So that's my background. Here's the total conclusion of the whole paper, just in case I don't have enough time to finish. Basically 2 points. First of all, China is pro-Palestine. I will give one very, I think, powerful empirical evidence for this statement here. When I say this in China, it's not going to be argued. But when I say this in this context, especially in DC, probably it's a problem. But I don't see many people from the Jewish lobby here, so it doesn't matter really. I will give evidence and I give some reasonings, and the reasoning is going to echo very, very strongly with the keynote speaker, Professor Ben Meir's statement, the psychological side of it. I'll explain why later in detail. And second point I want to make is, even though we have this stance, pro-Palestine, we haven't done anything yet. China has not done anything significant or even trivial about this stance yet. I'm talking about China today, after being the, I don't know, the #1 import-export trade country a few months ago. We haven't done anything yet. And there's a potential we'll do something, but the time window is not that urgent. I will say something about the future trajectory of the stance and China's decision mechanism. I think this is probably the most interesting thing if you are working in one of the think tanks in this city. I'll for the first time on the record explain how it works, how Chinese Xi Jinping or other people make decisions in terms of what to do with Israel, what to do with the coming visit of President Obama to this country, okay? And how China might be influenced. So if you're one of the think tank people, you'll be interested in that too, because China can be influenced. As Professor Davidson, who is not here anymore, complained about the democratic system in this country is not working the right way. China is imitating this country, so it works very similar to the U.S. way. So it can be influenced. You don't need to grab the vote of 1.2 billion people to influence Chinese decision. Okay. Background. The most important background. You want to learn a little bit about what today's talk is basing itself on. It would be recently, 5-6 months ago, an article I published in the Journal of Israel Studies. And over there, as you can see, I spent 20 pages explaining, review the history and see what's the direction. And I basically made 2 statements. First is China-Israel, Sino-Israel relationship is at a crossroad. And second of all, China has a shared mentality with used to have a shared mentality with the Jewish people. Used China's Opium War as the Chinese example and the Holocaust. But today, China probably share more of the Palestinian Nakba instead of the Jewish Holocaust, and I have some argument there. So that's the base. Since the publication of that article is not a long time ago, I do get a lot of questions from my Jewish friends, because unfortunately or fortunately, none of my Islamic or Arabic friends read it. So because the journal's title, okay, so nobody cares. The Jewish friend says, how do you prove China is pro-Palestine? We can now simply trust what you just say, even on the record, but you don't give any empirical evidence. That's the main thing I'm going to do today within the 15 minutes time frame here. And also I'm going to say China, even though pro-Palestine, haven't done anything yet. To understand China's view of the Middle East in general, or the relationship between Israel and Palestine in particular, we have to understand one key point, which is the main central focus, the predominant factor of Chinese foreign policy, which is not the Middle East. Not at all. Middle East won't rank #5 even. It's the U.S. Okay? It's the #1 superpower in the world. So whatever China is doing over there or anywhere in the world has something to do, must have something to do with the China's relationship with the U.S. So I read a lot of articles, but I think personally, I think the most famous scholar who understands this point thoroughly is Professor Isaac Shihor, who is today, anyone probably know him, is he was here last December across a few blocks from here in the Middle East Institute talking about the Middle East, but mentioned about China, and he made that point very, very clearly. China is using anywhere relationship of China with any other parties in the world to balance its relationship with the U.S. Okay, so when we talk about Syria or Iran, China will think about Taiwan. Sounds unrelated, but it's very related because Taiwan is considered by the central government as an integral part of China. So whatever the U.S. do with Taiwan will reflect it directly, probably not immediately, but pretty soon, I would say within a month or two, in China's activity with Iran. Today, because Iran is a hot button, so we'll be with Iran. If the Iran issue is solved in whatever ways, probably would be Israel. Okay? That's one point I want to make. Israel would be the next one. Could be. And the national mentality of imperialism, sufferer, is something I explained very clearly in the last paper, but I want to show a picture here to give you a little bit of overview of how come the mentality. Okay, so China today's sympathy was there used to be sympathy with the Jewish people, and then today's sympathy with the Palestinians is all based on this shared mentality. Professor Ben Meir's statement would be psychological factor of the Chinese people. This is a picture drawn over 100 years ago. And you can figure out from many of the flags, these are the coalition force of 8 countries who actually collectively invaded. Back then there's no United Nations, not by United Nations resolution, but they collectively decided to go to China to fight a war against the central government, and later on fight a war on behalf of the central government against China's Boxer rebellions. So you don't need to know a lot of the history about China, but if you remember, you need to remember 1 year of modern Chinese history. It's not 1949. It's not the Israel Nakba 1948. It's 1840. Okay? That's the year you need to remember. 1 year about Chinese history, 1840, because that's the year when the British Army sent a group of warships all the way along the Yangtze River upward, fought a war against the Chinese government and won the war. And that's called the First Opium War. And that's the first time, probably in, I don't know, dozens, 1 dozen centuries or whatever, 1,000 years, that ever a foreign force got into into China. Not a force, I'm not talking about the minorities to the north or to the south. A foreign force, not of ethnic Han cultural background, went to China, fight the government, and defeated. And a lot of treaties ensued from then. That's considered the National Humiliation Day, which is actually, that war has nothing to do with the Japanese, but it's, the mentality started from there. Although we continued till when? Till today, till now. If you read newspaper about any news about the Chinese and our attitude towards the Japanese, with this background, you'll understand why China say something or the leadership say something that they say. Because this is whenever the leadership say anything, they want to get support or echo from the general public. They have to trace all the way back to 1840, the humiliation history, the start of the humiliation. These are 8 countries. Unfortunately or fortunately, U.S. is up here, and the Chinese mentality is, if you ever, and for any foreign countries, ever send a soldier to China, let's don't talk about democracy, that there's no democracy back then. you don't have any right to tell Chinese what to do within China or in the whole world. And because China never sent a soldier into your country. So this is a type of, I put here reciprocity. You send a soldier, we didn't send out the soldier. We had a war, and we lose or win, but we had a war, and it's fought on our land. Now it's the end of the story. Don't say anything because we never invaded you. So that's the mentality, very important. And the third point also reflected in terms of China's relationship with the Arab countries, because back in the 1950s, early 1950s, the new Communist Party establishes a new ruling, and China is isolated by almost all the Western countries. And as a foreign diplomatic strategy, back then China had strategies. The Premier Zhou Enlai had this famous talk and 5 principles of non-interference, peaceful coexistence at the Bandung Conference in 1955, and that's when China decided to line up with the Arab countries for a very simple reason. If you think in the IR terms, it's for interest because the Arab countries have more votes, and Israel didn't. And back then, Israel is actually more on the Soviet Union side, so it's not a big issue to consider to irritate Israel. So it's since then, for 20, 30 years, before China resumed a diplomatic relationship with the U.S., the Arab countries had always been in any voting settings the supporter of China. The one China policy was considering Taiwan as part of China. So that's something that China, the whole China, even the public or the leadership, consider a very important thing to return as a favor to support anything that the Arab countries today raise that is meaningful or sensible. So pro-Palestine on the theoretical level, there's this background. So that's only that's the background. But I said I'm going to give you some empirical data. It's later on. But before that, I'm going to talk about the decision-making process today. It covers maybe the last 3 decades. It's a simple system. It's simpler than this city, but it's complicated too because of non-transparency. It's simple. It's a think tank system. Think tanks run by universities, by private entities, very few of them, but getting more and more today. It's dozens of them coming out every half a year. And also by the Chinese Social Science Academy system, which is not only the one in Beijing, but almost every province has one, but have different focus on different policies. A few of the academy has focuses, like the one in Shanghai has focuses on foreign policy, but most of them focusing on internal politics and economic development. And the central Chinese Academy of Social Science and all other branches, think about the army, the intelligence, all have their own think tanks. The state-owned enterprises, PetroChina has its own think tanks, very big one, hundreds of researchers. And all these think tanks produce policy papers. And these policy papers get channeled up and get reviewed. But the review process is not that transparent. It's get reviewed by whoever, even my paper, I don't know, get reviewed by whom. But eventually, the good ones will climb up the ladder, eventually sit on the desk of Xi Jinping. You can assure every day Xi Jinping get to read dozens of policy papers written exactly by these think tank scholars. There are evidence, but I don't know whether people extensively write about it, but it is true, trust me, it is true. I cannot produce evidence, and I was told today is not by Chatham House rule, so it's, so with that understanding, the Chinese scholars' view is actually very important because it will influence directly, collectively, directly the top leaders' view, the understanding of any region in the world, any problems in the country, in the world, so including the Middle East and Israel. And with that, I did a little bit of social science stuff, empirical evidence, database searching, statistics, stuff like that. Because I only one person, I haven't able to recruit for this paper enough assistant yet. So I reviewed 6 years of article, but I choose the 6 years based on all these exhaustive databases. Okay, all these exhaustive. It sounds scary. A lot of writings. That is, and the time frame is the first 3 years. Choosing 1992 is because it's the first year that China and Israel established a formal diplomatic relationship in January of 1992. I can only do 3 years, but the whole thinking, the initiative started with the reading of some articles in 2012. I found some interesting trends, so I decided to do 3 years from 2012 backward to 2010. And what I did is I read all the articles. It's very time consuming. It took me 3 months, and it's not many. You will see the numbers. And I mark every article with a tag, and is neutral, basically saying things with a balanced fashion or very scholarly. All these publications, except for the travel logs or opinion pages, newspaper opinion pages, all of them are very scholarly, trying to draw evidence from all directions, trying to give a balanced view, because these are scholars trying to show the government or the reader or peer review process that they're doing a good scholarly job. And I marked the pro-Palestinian comments or conclusion in the paper, a P, and a pro-Israeli is with an I. And as you can imagine, it's never fully objective to do this kind of things. Okay, but for most of the paper, it's pretty easy to call it's pro-Palestinian or Israel. It's actually very easy, much easier than I imagined when I started the whole process. And here are the numbers. As you can see on the very right column, it's not a lot of, the number is not big. There are overlaps, there are repetitions, and I deduct a few, clean up the data a little bit. These are the total number. And the search term actually is not Israel or Palestine, but Israel and Palestine. And the Chinese language, you do Israel and Palestine, you consider whoever knows Chinese, including the noun, the nationality, the adjectives, the nation all together. So it's pretty easy to do the search, and it's pretty accurate. In English searching these databases messy result, but the Chinese very accurate, consistent results. And you can see for the first 3 years and the last 3 years. And to be more visually obvious, this is what you can see. And I probably will do, I'll probably put all these data later on in some version of the paper or the project. 1995 all the way to 2009. You can see the total number of the articles down at the second row is not very dramatically different from the one I have over there. And you'll see a jump of numbers starting from 2001. I have a hunch, but I never double checked it. It's probably the Intifada, a lot of newspaper come out, newspaper articles. And basically from 2006, you have, I observed a dramatic increase of theses, master's theses, a few doctor dissertations. It's also included in the search. And here's the graph. So there's not much need to be said about the graph, right? And so I was, with that data, I was trying to explain the data. Was reading, read all the articles. I have a lot of observations. I'm gonna, how am I doing on time? 5 minutes here. So I just said that 1992, I turned the period between 1992 and 1994 the time of the honeymoon period, because China and Israel just established a relationship and a lot of interest about the country, the mysterious country. On that same year, actually, China established foreign diplomatic relationship with 3 countries. If you know a little bit about sinology or Chinese studies, you will see these countries are kind of interestingly related. South Korea, South Africa, and Israel. These are the 3 countries in 1992 to have a formal relationship established. And China, even though the Communist Party has its own censorship, publicity bureau at different level has its own censorship. But the interesting is that the authors themselves, knowing the censorship, they want to publish, they will do self-censoring by themselves. So obviously 1992, 93 is not a good year to publish anything pro-PLO or attacking Israel. So they do the self-censor. That explains why there are very, very few pro-Palestinian papers. But there are 6, 7, 8 of them every year. And one observation I have is actually all these authors have been to Israel, or journalists living in the area, know on the first-hand knowledge about the situation of the Palestinians, and they all sympathize the Palestinians instead of sympathizing or admiring the glorious Israel. Okay, and to 1994, you know, I mean the peace agreement happening a few miles from here with the shake hands, and a plethora of articles praising the peace process is there. So it's still neutral, relatively neutral. But we move the time all the way to the last 3 years. It's changing very dramatically. Well, if not all of the authors of media articles and research papers have been, most of the authors of the 2010, 2012 article having a very common feature. They all been to the region. They stayed there at least for a year, because one of the reasons is because China has providing more money to scholarship. So they went there, and then these people come back. They didn't come back pro-Israel, because most of the universities are in Israel. So they visit Israel, stay there, they visit some cities of Palestine, Ramallah, Hebron, and they come back almost unanimously pro-Palestine. Okay, and I gave an example of one article. You have quotations, references down there. Fan Hongda, who spent actually, this is a friend of mine, spent like 2 months in Hebron and did this research paper, a very solid paper, and have this conclusion that I highlighted in red, what he mostly want to say. And the other paper I'm quoting here, because it's directly relevant to my point here. And this is a paper by Xu Jin. I don't know the author, but the statement here, he wrote this paper based on, I have a footnote in my article on about a dozen U.S. sources. It's not only by his understanding of Chinese sources. He has 10 Chinese sources, and he has this very, very, well, as you can see, to mark this as P is not hard, right? It's no ambiguity here. And all these, I mean, I'm only putting two very, very prominent examples. All these papers, all these scholars, collectively, dozens of them, are influencing, by their policy paper, the central government on different levels, that we are more pro-Palestinian. Imagine the leadership in every morning you get up, you read books, read article, policy papers, are produced, if not all by these authors, mostly by them. I happen to know probably 2/4 of the authors, half of the authors, three-quarters maybe in trade conferences in the Chinese Middle Eastern Study Association. We have many of the authors showed up, and you can imagine the future is getting bigger and bigger, because more and more younger generation of scholars with their master's thesis, PhD dissertations, writing in the same direction. Is nobody, no U.S. people or anyone from Israel tell them to write this, or Chinese write it. It's just a natural. I would say you can go back all the way to the mentality of the Chinese as a sufferer of the imperialist invasion stuff. Maybe that's the reason. And then this is the empirical data. And for that, I mean, would you be, if you're Israeli or you're a lobbyist working for the Israelis in this city, are you worried? My conclusion is no, because is it out of time?
Yeah.
Time? Just 1 more minute. Okay. China has this tendency, but we haven't done anything. This is my second point, because first of all, China needs to focus on economic issues. I led a delegation of 30 business people visiting all these places in Palestine, trying to find investment opportunities. Most of these people, many of them Muslims actually, big business people in the Middle East, decided not to invest in Palestine because all the limitations Israel putting and all the different not promising sides of the economy. And China might, in the future, change. I mean, all these papers going up, and China is no longer in China. Right now, you can see from the Diaoyuo Senkaku dispute with the Japanese, the new leadership is trying to do something in the direction of not 100% economic. Okay, trying to, you can say revenge, or you can say adjusting the policy direction to trying to sort out justices. And the last quote, and for that I will conclude, is this is a retired diplomat, and the red one is saying, and the keyword is justice. China is trying to seek justice only by supporting the justice of the Palestinians, and as understood by the Chinese leadership, we can gain support of China's own quest for justice in terms of our relationship with the Japanese, or with other countries, or also with Taiwanese. And I'll skip this, and more questions you can email me, or you allow me a few minutes to...
Sure. Thank you. Questions. I know the time's running short, so we'll take up questions. Just two observations. One, Dr. Chen had somebody from Israel sent me a message after they look at the program and wanted to know if they can contact Dr. Chen to invite him to make a presentation in Israel. So I think Dr. Chen will have a chance to present that case in Israel, which is really a very good balancing act, so to speak. I'll leave the other one. Questions from the audience? Dr. Segal? You have a question? Yes, go ahead.
I know there's no formal Chinese position on this, but to get a sense substantively about what would constitute Chinese position among the scholars or the sense of justice, I wonder if you could address the position that this group would take for the final status issues, let's say using the Clinton parameters as a jumping off point for explaining, would they be on any of those parameters, if you could identify what you would say the position of Chinese scholars would be on any of the final status issues.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's an excellent question, and it's regrettable, also probably easy to answer this by saying that actually most of the, or none of the papers, including myself, ever touch upon the technical details of the peace solution. My center called the Middle Eastern Peace Study Center, but we refer not only to the peace between Palestine and Israel. And the technical details, we believe the U.S., with tons of excellent scholars trained for the last half a century during the Cold War, never solved the problem. But Professor Ben Meir downstairs in the keynote speech, I think he touched upon the main issue. I don't know how important he is in this city in terms of advising President Obama, but I would suggest probably that's the direction, and that's what China can do together with the U.S. if the U.S. is sincere to do that, to solve the psychological issue. Because without the psychology solved, any technical border will be eventually passed, and no peace is sustainable, I think.
Yes, please.
You've shown us what the political orientation is among Chinese scholars. Is that also reflected in a cultural orientation, which is now more deeply involved with Islam, Palestinian culture?
Well, that's a two-sided sword, because China has its own problem with its Islamic population. And the problem somewhat is a little bit exaggerated in the Western media in terms of Xinjiang, the Uyghur problem, the Islamic Hui problem, but it's still a sensitive issue internally. And China has this meritocracy system, which I haven't a chance to touch upon, is to promote leadership from the very bottom. So all the leaders at the very top has run a county a university, a small office, all the way till they run the whole country. But China does not have this meritocracy system within the foreign policy channel. So that's why we have no strategists in the foreign policy arena, only people who handling day-to-day issues. And on the religious relationship with our minorities, with our different religious sectors, as you can see in Western media, China is kind of demonized, is because we don't have this system too, either, with a meritocracy all the way from the bottom to the top. So I don't think China will play the pro-Islamic card, not in the near future, not in the longer run.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I'm just trying to understand the Chinese national interest with respect to benefits of affiliation or identification with the Palestinians in the Arab-Israeli situation versus the Chinese national interest in no longer being more sympathetic to the Israeli side. And I say to myself, well, certainly there was a tremendous support for China when Taiwan was expelled from the United Nations. On the other hand, technologically, the innovations and entrepreneurship of Israel offer a lot of technological value, I think, as the Chinese economy becomes more and more sophisticated. And I wonder if you would comment on that.
Okay, as I said in the very beginning, Israel, in my previous article, I spent like 5 pages saying Israel's value in terms of technology trade and their advanced innovation system, the benefit to China. But this is not only from Israel. China works closely with Silicon Valley to gain the similar stuff, and a lot of Israelis in the Silicon Valley, vice versa. So Israel, by itself, the control of technology, especially the early transfer of military technology to China, is no longer going to happen very soon again with the U.S. interference. So with that kind of secret military help gone, the past era, today with the open transfer of technology is no longer, Israel doesn't have a predominant advantages. However, whether you believe the Israel lobby or not, the theory, the professors and the Davidson's statement, it's a fact that the Jewish lobby play a very important role to the U.S. government, and we do understand, the Chinese think tanks do understand, playing with these lobbies, pressing some hot buttons will make a difference in this city, on the Capitol Hill or in President Obama's office. So that's considered more important in terms of China is always trying to. No leadership will want to have the reputation of the leader who lost Taiwan or the leader who lose Diaoyu Island to the Japanese. And we had such a generation of leaders. So the priority is China's own territory. We're considered the Middle Kingdom, even though it's a country. It's a culture emphasized on the unity of the territory. We know the loss of the territory by the Jewish people and all the tragedies.
But there's also a counterpoint. I don't know if you read recent articles, probably in the last month or so, about some of the Jewish organizations, the politically oriented organizations, are actually increasing their lobbying efforts in China. So therefore, there is a trend, yes, there is a trend now to really form some kind of political lobbying on behalf of either Israel or the Jewish lobby in China to influence its policy.
Yes, I actually meet many of the groups myself.
Yes.
I have a question. You said in 1992 there were a few countries that China established relationships with in South Africa, and I actually happened to live there for a period, so it struck me. But it's also fascinating, the longest surviving culture in the world has only really been China in the international diplomatic political community in the last 50 years, where it's spread out. But during the era of America's trying to challenge communism spread around the world, many revolutionary groups in different parts of Latin America and Africa. I know the ANC, their leaders were working their way up and went from Tanzania across to China, ultimately to look for support if only the moral guidelines of how do you successfully conclude a revolution. So there was that connection in the outside world, but fortunately the world has kind of forgotten all that. It wasn't your ideological grounds, but so there must have been a connection with South Africa then as a reward for the ANC because they helped steward them through. But now is that just kind of as your country evolves in the international stage, that was just a period of time and maybe wouldn't support international revolutions in the same way?
Well, you know, I've been to South Africa a couple of times, very short, but I'm not an expert on that, the relationship between China and South Africa. But what I can say, additional piece of information in 1992 for all these Chinese studies scholars in here, is that's the year Deng Xiaoping went to the southern Shenzhen after the isolation of China by the Western world after the 1989 Tiananmen Square tragedy. I call it a tragedy. And that's the shift by Deng, by the leadership, to understand actually all the way back to 1940, or the 100 year of humiliation, as the Chinese Communist Party called it. The only solution is to build our economy, to use economic power to build our military power, and then talk to the world superpowers. And that's a shift, and that's South Korea, South Africa, Israel works to that direction, and it's part of a small piece of the big jigsaw puzzle. So ideology is no longer important on this way.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Our next speaker is Dr. Pervez Mohsin. Pervez Mohsin is lecturer at the Department of Sciences and Humanities, National University of Computer and Engineering Sciences. He has taught undergraduate courses covering global history, world religion, and international relations. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Mohsin.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to come here. Although I teach in a technical university, but the department I belong to is the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. So the courses that I offer is in humanities, basically. Sir. This is the topic that I chose. Basically, is a huge topic, and I understand is also a complicated topic, is a diverse topic, is a broad topic, and to cover all that in 15 minutes is going to take some effort. But it's just what I'm going to do today is basically suggest a few points. It's not the solution. I mean, I can't. I'm just too humble to think about providing a solution, but a few things, thinking out loud, sort of, to understand what's going on. It's my own view, the way I see it, and basically the peace in the Middle East. The key topic that I focus on is how to identify pieces of puzzles to perceive the bigger picture, the attainment of peace in the Middle East. And basically the idea is just that as we put together pieces, sometimes when we're doing it in our homes, we're putting together pieces of puzzles. And this last few pieces, everything we have put together, there's a few pieces we just can't see sitting there. Just can't seem to figure it out. And that's the situation sometimes that I feel that as things are there, somebody has to, or people have to get together in some mindset. Somebody has to see it, the overall picture, instead of looking at something and you're trying all kinds of things, but it's not really working. And so what is it that we can do? What is it that's not working? So that's the idea. People sitting around, and we have been doing it for so many years. But somehow it doesn't seem to work. So let's see, this is the way. This is partially they're trying everything, but another idea that occurred to me is that while I was thinking about how to come to terms and things, there's a concept of a grand unified theory in particle physics. And then what they're doing is basically looking at the different forces and trying to come up with how to unite these three forces, at least the electromagnetic, the weak forces, and the strong forces. And so far they have done three. The fourth one they have not done it. After, and that's gravitational force too. And then if they have that, then we have theory of everything. So far we don't have theory of everything, but we have grand unified theory that we are putting together, coming up, looking at different forces individually, how they're working, and then coming up and uniting the three. That's the idea, and then trying to apply the scientific idea to the social science, and then thinking in terms of Middle East, all kinds of different forces working together to pull apart. So what is it that's going to come and bring them together in one unified theory? That's the idea of grand unified theory, coming up with grand unified theory to attain peace in the Middle East. That's what I'm looking at. Okay, so the person who have gone through this, Mr. George Mitchell, he says that I believe there's no such thing as a conflict that cannot be ended. They are created and sustained by human beings. They can be ended by human beings. That's his idea. So somebody is optimistic about coming up with some solution of what is going on. And it's not one thing. So we're talking about Palestinian issue, we're talking about Iranian issue, we're talking about the uprising in the recent Middle East, all kinds of different things, and trying to figure out what's going on, what is going to be the future of the Middle East. So we're looking at major stakeholders, basically, and forces, internal forces of a particular country, external forces that are working out there, such as the United States and other emerging economies, such as China and Japan and Korea, and what their role will be in the future of shaping Middle East and Middle Eastern politics. All that, and we just heard a distinguished speaker about from Chinese perspective. So that's what I'm looking at. So who are these stakeholders and what are we looking at? So let's take a few cases here. It's about Iran and Israel and what's going on. So this, I looked at different people and different papers published and books, and especially this one attracted me quite a bit, and this professor from Tel Aviv University. And this is what he has to say when he looked at the situation in the Middle East. And then he says that, pretty optimistic, from my point of view, that sitting in Israel and looking at this, and it's a different perspective. It's a light of hope, a light at the end of the tunnel somehow. And I'm looking for those lights, basically. There's somewhere you're sitting, whether you're sitting in Tehran, you're sitting in Tel Aviv, you're sitting in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, you're sitting in Palestine, wherever you're sitting, looking for those hopes and how to put those things, because the problem so far is that we tend to focus on differences. We don't tend to focus on common ground. If we begin to turn towards common ground, I think that will help a little bit, and that's a starting point. So, and of course, there's no one size fits all solution. Because if you're talking about different countries in the Middle East, yes, majority Muslims, but if you look at Saudi Arabia and then look at Jordan, look at Iran, look at other countries, different socioeconomic problem, different psychological, different historical background, and everybody's focusing in different ways on how to solve the problem in their own ways. Sometimes we're going to talk about very briefly about the media, the role of media plays, and the way the terminology is being used in the media, especially Western media, and how it actually deviates people from actually focusing the peace in the Middle East. One of the things that they focus these days on sectarian lines, and we talk about that a little bit. Usually when we talked about when Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, first of all, we didn't know who invaded who. And then afterwards, it was the idea of the Shiite versus Sunnite. And you can see these words a lot these days in television programs. Shiite, Iran, and Sunnite, the rest of the world, the Arabic world. It's not really simple, because then you supported Saddam for 8 years. And then what happens? It's supposed to be a Sunnite. At the end of that Iran-Iraq war, what happens? He invades another Sunnite brother. So it's not really Shia Sunnite thing. Principally, if you look at the principle, at the down bottom, the principle of Islam, that's not really that much difference. But is that the media comes up with the terminology sometimes very confusing, and people a lot of time talk about it without realizing what they're talking about. So it's not the Shia Sunnite, the issue is something beyond that. So that's one. Again, recent uprising. Who is going to benefit? That's another question. What is going on? Look at why the question that comes to my mind: why didn't the Arab Spring took place in all the countries? Why was it suppressed in some countries, and why was it successful in other countries? Also, so-called successful. Tunisia started out with Tunisia. Fine, you remove the guy. Then what happened in Egypt? So basically, who is playing behind the role, and what is at stake that is actually fueling, and then making a success? What's going to be the future of it? Who is going to play a major role in the future of the Middle East? You heard the East in China, and we have since the World War I, we have been seeing in World War II, the France, the Great Britain, and then now the United States. During Cold War, Russia, West and the East. Who is going to be playing major role? And I believe is going to be a combination. If you want to have real peace, you need to have a combination, because the focus of the West in the Middle East is different than the focus of the East at the moment. And we'll see how that is. So what role would be played by the current and emerging economies, international influences in the Middle East, and how we solve that puzzle? And that would be easy in a minute. I will show it to you how that is. Number one, people are interested in the oil of Middle East, and you can see the top 20 countries you hear the oil. And one of the very interesting thing is that the United States does not get majority of its oil from Middle East. It's about 12% or so that it gets it from Middle East. But you can see the reserve oil, and this is why we see majority of people. And oil is one of the things that the people they're interested in Middle East, whether it's East or the West. All right. And this is old data, but you can see the Chinese and Japanese export. So it's, first of all, it's oil import from Middle East to these countries, and then export from the Chinese and the Japanese economy and the Korean economy that is being exported to the Middle Eastern country, and is also huge and increasing. So oil from Middle East, and then export from Japan and China, dependence of Middle Eastern countries in Chinese and Japanese products, both electronics and otherwise. And so it's a mutual thing. So it's not only just oil is one way, the other way street is also quite important. Let's get quickly the other one. Okay, look at this, for example. Close to 70% of Japanese crude oil import comes from 6 Middle Eastern countries. And Japanese have 54 nuclear power plants. The problem is that you have a lot of earthquake problem. In recent tsunami and earthquake, they have lost a lot. So they're basically focusing something, and in the future, they're not going to let it go. as the future goes, 70% of its oil needs are coming from Middle East. So Middle East is an important as far as the East is concerned, same as China. And you look at this, the Chinese influence in the rest of the world. It's not only Middle East. Chinese influence in Africa, and if you're coming from China to Africa, you have to go through Middle East also. Central, before you get to Africa, there is a Middle East in the center. So it's not only oil coming from Middle East to China, but it's also a lot of other connections the Chinese have, and Middle East is playing a key role in all that scenario. And then right now it is playing a soft spot. People are liking Chinese stand as versus American stand in Middle East. And this is why it's Chinese slowly, gradually, is going to have, right now they're not playing power politics. Japanese are interested, Chinese are interested, but they're not. Future holds, they may be, but not at the moment the way the US has been seen in the Middle East. And another problem is the way media shows American public opinion about Middle East is different. How about Middle Eastern public opinion about the United States and the politics and the policies of the United States? You have to look both sides. So history, psychology, sociology, economics all play a role. And this is Sabri Roy, this is one of the articles that I read. The world leaders, including EU, European Union, United States, UN leaders, along with Arabs and Israeli leaders, should focus on finding a common ground and try to translate each other's language. That's another problem. What we say is what we don't understand, and try to understand what the Middle East problem really is, and whether the crisis is primarily religious, political, or otherwise. And that's the problem. See, the United States have Voice of America, VOA, in different countries, including Pakistan. You see, you have Voice of America showing half an hour, good channels, good things about the US. That's fine. On the other hand, you turn around, and then the drone attacks, and all kinds of things that has been taken negatively. So all that effort, all that investment that you're doing in channelizing this, it actually backfires sometimes. So this is, public opinion polls have borne out, it's actually downturn. Iraq and Afghanistan and so far. And especially, I mean, even if the regime is pro-US, what about the public opinion, the majority of people? That's kind of worrisome. And if you talk about the Arabic Spring, people taken over, and the majority of people have a different opinion than the current governments, then we have to think about those in those terms also. No, it's actually not. My hands are not used to this, and this is not used to my hands. Another aspect I thought maybe I should, discuss just very briefly is the religious common ground of people in the Middle East. But when we say Palestine or Palestinians, we're not talking about Muslims only. People in Palestine, we have Christians, we have Jews, we have Muslims. Moses, Jesus, Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, all these are very common name among Muslims also. So if you look at the background, and the historical Jewish background, and then the seeking refuge in Muslim lands, why don't we just extract that? And of course, if you're talking about the peace process in the Middle East, process we're focusing on. But if we are at the dinner table, in the media, in the schools, if we're getting different messages, how long you think peace process is going to work? If the messages coming from these other main places are different than what is being said in the media. Okay, I'm going to go for real quick. Community is formed by what we have in common, but what we have in common is given to us through communication. Okay, let's go faster here because I don't have much time left, I think. Psychology, history, perception through media, the way we perceive each other, and the way we react against each other. Media playing role, and the effect of media playing role in the Middle East and around the world, especially in the United States. And mostly images. So again, the question is how to identify the pieces of puzzles to perceive a bigger picture. And there's all these aspects that we discussed. And the question in my struggle is how to come up with a solution, how to find those common grounds. One more. That's it.
We'll save the questions for after our second speaker, Dr. Jerome Segal, who would like to describe himself as a person who thinks out of the box, and he's the director of Peace Consultancy Project at the University of Maryland and the founder and president of the Jewish Peace Lobby. Dr. Segal.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about Jerusalem, and I'm going to really emphasize two things. One being that the way in which we talk about Jerusalem affects the extent to which we're making or not making a contribution to solving the issue, that the language is enormously important. And then the second is I'm going to talk very specifically about what I think the heart of the Jerusalem problem is, which is the Temple Mount, and talk about an approach that I call sovereignty belongs to God, which I think is the most useful way of approaching the Temple Mount sovereignty issue. But let me start by calling to your attention a recent polling question about Jerusalem. And this was put both to the Israeli public and the Palestinian public. And it was with respect to a particular compromise on Jerusalem. And it went something of this sort. What was proposed was that East Jerusalem would become the capital of the Palestinian state, with the Arab neighborhoods coming under Palestinian sovereignty and Jewish neighborhoods coming under Israeli sovereignty. The old city, including the Al-Haram al-Sharif as a Temple Mount, would come under Palestinian sovereignty, with the exception of the Jewish quarter and the Wailing Wall that would come under Israeli sovereignty. Okay, so here are the three specifics. East Jerusalem would be the capital of the Palestinian state. East Jerusalem would be divided along the lines that Clinton suggested, that is, what is Arab would become Palestinian, what is Jewish would become Israeli. And third, Palestinians would get sovereignty over the Temple Mount, Israelis would get sovereignty over the Western Wall. And the first 2 points were accepted by Ehud Barak in the Taba negotiations. In the Annapolis round, Olmert accepted the first principle, that is, with respect to the neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, but rejected the idea of clear-cut Palestinian sovereignty over the Temple Mount, as Barak did as well. In fact, no Israeli government has agreed to that third part of this polling question, that the Palestinians would get clear-cut sovereignty over the Temple Mount. So we have a question about a solution that's more Palestinian than anything that the most let's say, accommodating Israeli government has yet been prepared to do. Nonetheless, only 29% of the Palestinian public accepted this solution. It was rejected by 70%. And on the Israeli, 38% agreed with this and 59% rejected it. So you had clear majorities rejecting this on both sides. If you made this more pro-Palestinian, you lose even more Israelis. If you made it more pro-Israelis, you lose even more Palestinians. So, and then we have the current government. We've got Netanyahu who rejects any elements of this compromise. And even with the centrist Yair Lapid, who came in second, his party Yesh Atid, Lapid had this to say about Omer. Omer's government went too far. And he says, I oppose any withdrawal in Jerusalem, which isn't only a place, but an idea as well. And then the recent article in Haaretz reported that he said this, Jerusalem is the founding ethos of the state of Israel, and a state if it gives up a fundamental ethos. So from this, one could reasonably conclude that the sides are just too far apart on Jerusalem, that it's, you just really can't bridge the gap. I actually tend to take a different perspective, and I think that a lot of what we sometimes think we know about Jerusalem, especially from different kinds of polls and studies, comes from the language that's used. And even when we hear politicians, it comes from the language that they use. Now, a number of years ago, actually in the very heady early days of the Oslo process, I teamed up with some of the top Israeli and Palestinian social scientists, and we did a major study of how Jerusalem was understood both by the Israeli public, Jewish public, and by Palestinians. And it was the most extensive study of this sort that's ever been done at that point, and it's never been repeated. And while the specific numbers, no doubt, are out of date, there are still many things that we learned in the study that underlie the numbers that are quite significant. And when I undertook the study, the common wisdom was that Jerusalem was the last remaining part of the national consensus in Israel. It was the third rail of Israeli politics, and it was viewed as non-negotiable. There's no compromises on Jerusalem. I found this approach to Jerusalem hard to intuitively accept. And one reason was the geography of the history. Jerusalem, of course, has been sacred to all three religions, but if you look at the city itself, up until 1845, this is Jerusalem, less than 1 square mile. You have this expansion outside the city, starting in the late 19th century. Here's what it looked like in 1910. By 1949, it was this. And here's the current that it's near the municipal boundaries in 1976. Historic Jerusalem constitutes only 1% of what we're talking about when we're talking about Jerusalem today. So for almost the entire history of Jerusalem, what we've been referring to as Jerusalem is totally different than what we're talking about as Jerusalem today. And how can those meanings of Jerusalem that are embedded in the history and the religion and the religious texts and so on, but that only referred to this little nugget, carry over with the same kind of emotion as when we have 99% or 90% greater, actually 99% more as today. So that was one thing. If you look at the second slide, please. The other thing that was that we hear a lot about what happened in the result of the 67 war, which was the unification of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been divided by the 49 war, and the old city was controlled by Jordan. The Israelis were cut off from it, cut off from the wall, from the Wailing Wall. And Jerusalem was reunified when Israel drove Jordanian forces out of all of the West Bank. Okay? And we hear about how Jerusalem will never again be divided and the unification of Jerusalem. But what most people don't know, and it's a truly striking fact, is that what East Jerusalem was during the period in which it was divided is identified by this line over here. Here's the old city, and this green area here, and this little blue area. But this was East Jerusalem, okay? Right after Israel reunified the city, what it did within weeks is it changed the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, and it reached into West Bank areas, villages, village land that surrounded both Jerusalem east and west, and it came up with this municipal boundary here. And it brought into what it called East Jerusalem, something like 22 Arab villages or lands of 22 Arab villages. And it made that municipal boundaries of East Jerusalem. It expanded East Jerusalem, as it were, ninefold. So the divided city was this. But now, what Israel was calling East Jerusalem, right, was 9 times larger than what East Jerusalem had been when the city was divided. So the question is, how can this relatively arbitrary inclusion and expansion of East Jerusalem still be treated psychologically and politically as the divided part of the city? So that seemed to be the intuitive thing. One of the things that we did in the study, because the next slide, Max, was to disaggregate the Jerusalem question. And instead of talking about Jerusalem as a whole, to start talking about different parts of the city. And what we did, you probably can't read this from there, but we broke the city up into the Western Wall, the Old City, the Old Jewish neighborhoods, the Mount of Olives, and then the Israeli neighborhoods, the non-Jewish parts of the Old City, the Arab downtown, and some of the Arab village areas. And we asked Israelis, how important to you as Jerusalem are these different parts of the city? And one of the results that we got was that no matter what group you talk to among Israelis, you got one consistent pattern, which is that no Israelis thought of the city when you disaggregated it as much of a muchness. There was enormous importance given to certain parts that were important from a Jewish religious point, or the old city when treated as a whole, where Jews live. Right, numbers like 91%, 90%, and so on. But as soon as you started talking about the Arab parts of the city, it fell off to numbers like 30%, 20%, and so on as extremely important. And even with respect to Arab areas inside the old city, we found an enormous drop-off of importance. And we found on the Palestinian side an analogous pattern on the Palestinian side. And if you took a map of the important parts of the city, the Israelis, an important part of the city, the Palestinians, and you put one on top of the other, it would turn out that there was only one part of the city that was important, that truly important, extremely important to both peoples, and that was the Old City. And with respect to the Old City, it was really only the Temple Mount. Now, I'm not saying that everything else is unimportant. It's as important as anything else. Like if I fight over the West Bank, it could be important. But into that unique power that is generally attributed to Jerusalem as a whole, really only fell, it seemed to us, with respect to the Old City. So what I wanted to suggest maybe are some rules for speaking. One of the things that made this truly extraordinary, and this is a linguistic fact, which has plagued, I think, the negotiations, which is that the world, go back to the map of Jerusalem, the world as a whole, and I would include the Palestinians in this, right, adopted the Israeli terminology and began to talk about East Jerusalem in a way that corresponded to these artificial municipal boundaries that had no place in history, okay? And this is particularly strange that this happened because this action by the Israelis was universally condemned. And I don't mean just by the General Assembly. In 1969, the Security Council passed Resolution 267 with the United States voting for it. And one of the things that it said is that all legislative and administrative measures and actions by Israel which purport to alter the status of Jerusalem, including the expropriation of land and properties, are invalid. And so there was this determination of the entire world that this redefinition and scooping up of West Bank towns and villages and calling it Jerusalem was invalid, and yet the entire world adopted that terminology. And by adopting that terminology and calling what I call the East Jerusalem expansion zone, that is the part of what is now in the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, but outside of what had historically been the eastern part, this expansion zone, by simply referring to that as East Jerusalem, it made the issue of solving the status of that more difficult, both for Israelis to accept and for Palestinians to accept. Because it suddenly became that what we're talking about is actually redividing Jerusalem or chopping up Jerusalem, when this has never been Jerusalem. Okay? And this is most of what East Jerusalem actually is. So I wanted to suggest, among other things, some rules for language. First is to stop talking about Jerusalem as a whole. Never talk about Jerusalem as a whole. If someone says something like Jerusalem cannot be divided or Jerusalem is this, ask them, what do you mean by Jerusalem? And force them to answer, among other things. One of the things that's really quite striking here, this right here, you can't see it, inside municipal Jerusalem, that's a refugee camp. Can you imagine there's a Palestinian refugee camp, refugee camp inside the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem? Right? And ask someone who says Jerusalem can't be divided is whether or not they want a refugee camp inside of Israel. And what you'll find, among other things, is that they don't. One of the things that shows that completely is that in recent years, when they built the security wall, the separation wall, this enormous barrier, right? The barrier actually cuts off parts of Jerusalem. The Shuvah refugee camp, even though it's inside the municipal boundaries, is now on the other side of the wall, as are certain areas up at the top. And it's not been an issue. As far as I know, it's never been a controversial issue among Israeli Jews, right? Even though Jerusalem has actually been physically divided, right? So it depends on how you talk about it. Now, I think that one of the things that would be useful would be if we located the Jerusalem issue. One of the things that would be useful is if we set the Jerusalem issue in the larger discussion of borders and settlements. Because if we stop referring to all of this as Jerusalem, it's well established that the borders are going to have to be modified, and that Israel is going to annex settlements that are very close to the border, and there's going to be land swaps to compensate the Palestinians for that. And if we stop calling this the boundaries of Jerusalem, then what we refer to as Jewish neighborhoods would be, as Palestinians sometimes refer to them, as settlements. And not very different from these areas, which are Jewish settlements, that it's largely accepted are going to go to Israeli sovereignty in exchange for land swap. And so we can demystify the Jerusalem issue that way. The hardest part is going to be the Temple Mount. And the negotiations have struggled over the issue with respect to sovereignty over the Temple Mount, which side has sovereignty. I want to say two things about this. First of all, I actually think, even though this is what's been negotiated over, there may be some deep confusion here that of two really different questions. One question is, where is the Temple Mount? That is, whose country is it in? When we draw the final borders, is it inside of Israel or is it inside of Palestine? Israel is sovereign over all of Israel. Palestine would be sovereign over Palestine. So the sovereignty issue, to some extent, is a struggle over where is the Temple Mount. There's another issue, which is, to who does the Temple Mount belong? Which is not the same question of where it is. The Temple Mount could be anywhere, and there'd still be a question of to who does it belong? It's a piece of property. Who owns it? Imagine, for instance, under the original United Nations plan, which was that Jerusalem would be a corpus separatum, the 47th plan, right? This still was a question. So the Temple Mount of all of Jerusalem was, in terms of where it is, the answer was not in Israel and not in Palestine. It was outside the boundary of both states, right? But there was still a question of who owns the Temple Mount? Whose is it? Who does it belong to? And that would have been the emotional question, not where it is. So it may be that fighting over sovereignty is the wrong thing to be fighting over. In any event, and that makes things much easier, because when we're talking about property, it's very different than when we're talking about sovereignty. Now, the sovereignty belongs to God formula, which I believe was articulated first by King Hussein of Jordan, is one of a variety of ways of not talking about the sovereignty issue. And the reason that it's good to not talk about the sovereignty issue is that sovereignty doesn't have to be determined. We basically have an administrative framework that has to be modified slightly. But we have an administrative framework in which basically the Muslim authorities control most of what goes on the Temple Mount, and that's been in place since '67. Where we have to find the way, actually, is to permanentize that administrative framework and to do it without raising the issues of sovereignty, because neither state is going to accept the other state's claim that it has political sovereignty over the Temple Mount. So you have to find a way of getting around that. Now, there are two versions of, one way to do it is to simply say, let's both sides agree that ultimate sovereignty belongs to God, and let's just go on and do administrative framework. We see the last slide next. Now, there are two versions of the sovereignty belongs to God framework. One is I go strong sovereignty belongs to God, and it's strong sovereignty, the one after that. This is the old city, and there's a data table that I want to show you. Okay, strong sovereignty belongs to God is both sides agree that nobody has sovereignty over the Temple Mount. So they accept basically that it's a zone of no sovereignty. Both of them give up their claims to political sovereignty, and they just go on and have the administrative framework. The weaker version, actually, neither side gives up its claim. They just simply agree that they can go on and live together without getting the other side to accept their claim. And so the two claims sit there, but they don't fight over it because they have an administrative agreement, And secondly, by saying ultimate sovereignty belongs to God, they bring in new symbolism that allows them to not struggle every day over political sovereignty, even though they haven't reached a conclusion to that. Now, one of the things that's most interesting about the sovereignty belongs to God framework is that when we study Palestinian responses to this framework, we ask them this question: there's a proposal that each side should stop arguing about sovereignty over the holy places in Jerusalem and agree that ultimate sovereignty belongs to God. Is such a proposal acceptable to you? We found a very strong Palestinian support for this. Okay? So on the national level, decidedly yes, 44% yes. So we had 64% of Palestinians said they supported this, and only 36% opposed it. And interestingly, when we broke it down by Islamist people whose parties were close to Hamas, the support went up. 77% of those who identified themselves as Islamists supported this. So I believe there's enormous and actually unique potential with respect to this framework. In my mind, what that means then is that in terms of the negotiability of Jerusalem, what I'm saying is that if we disaggregate Jerusalem, we start using the language that's appropriate to the artificiality of East Jerusalem, fold the Jewish neighborhoods, Palestinian neighborhoods, East Jerusalem, back into, that's not East Jerusalem, that's not Jerusalem at all, that's really West Bank, that's treated like the West of West Bank, settlement swaps, focus really on the core of it, the Temple Mount, and then we sidestep the Temple Mount using the administrative framework, Jerusalem becomes resolvable. And amazingly, it actually could turn out to be much easier to negotiate than many other issues. And were it successfully negotiated, the success at that would produce a regional transformation in attitudes towards Israel and would redound positively back to the security issues that have to do with borders. So we have a real breakthrough by moving along these lines.
Thank you so much for that. Well, you can either have your coffee break now or you can have 2 questions. So if you have them, we can really all go to the coffee break now. Okay, coffee break. Thank you.